Hello and welcome to our third web chat on working capital management. This one is about sustaining working capital success. We are joined again by Brian Shanahan, the CEO and founder of Informita and TermsCheck, who has huge experience on working on these projects for multinationals worldwide. Brian, for me, the core problem in working capital management was summed up by Ernie Caballero, corporate treasurer at UPS, when I was asking him about what his aims were for 2013. He responded saying, "My aim is to convince our organization to maintain the same internal disciplines in global liquidity and working capital measures. Do not let the standards slip." Isn't that what the problem is?
It is the problem for so many companies because, in the last 20, 30 years, there's less than 10 companies worldwide of the top 3,000 who've not just improved working capital, but actually maintained that improvement throughout. Yeah. So it's a very, very small subset of people who've really succeeded with this in the long term. And I can resonate with that phrase because, so many people do this as a project for short-term needs. And then, of course, the short-term need changes, and then the focus is gone, and then the standards slip.
So before we go on and look at a bit more detail, what for you is the objective of a working capital management program?
Well, I think for most companies, it's a relatively, shall we say, short to medium term objective. They want extra cash for some reason. And of course, they could go and borrow that cash. They could go and place shares. There's a lot of different ways, obviously, you can get working capital funding. The advantage of doing it internally is it hardly costs anything, and it's on your doorstep. So it really is a matter of corporate efficiency in the long run. I think the sad thing is that there's not more companies that actually look at this from a long-term view and say this is actually a core part of what we do along with all the other things in our business. And that's why there's so few that maintain working capital success.
So what are the obstacles, the big obstacles in terms of achieving this sustaining working capital success?
Well, I think the first one is lack of measurement. Just to give you an example, many years ago, I was with a large British engineering firm who had done a working capital program in the early 90s. And 10 years later, I came along to them, and they all knew what their standard term was and so on. But they believed that more than 90% of their spend was on that standard term. Turned out the answer was 43%, but they had no measurements in place to actually look at this month on month. And all that happened is that they'd done a program back in 91 and it slowly drifted downwards. And because they didn't measure it, they didn't know. Like in any business, there's many different competing priorities all the time. And therefore, this particular point was just, missed. And it's quite a shock to them when they found out, what the gap is. Now, I think there's more and more companies who do measure the basics of, DSO, DPO, DIO, and so on. But what you still find is that when you go a level beneath that into the transactional level, there's not that many companies that can actually look at their high-level numbers and then drill right into them, right down to the base invoice, the customer, the supplier, the particular part number, as the case may be, to understand what's really going on or potentially going wrong in their business that's causing these numbers to drift downwards.
So that's the first obstacle. What about changes in personnel? What's happening there?
Well, very often we have a project team assembled, just like for any project. They go and do some very good work, say over a year or two. Eventually someone says, well, this should be part of the normal business. The project's disbanded. People are sent to various different parts of the organization, or they leave or whatever. So a lot of the knowledge and experience that's within the organization itself, and particularly if they've used outside consultants, because then more experience is walked out the door, is that, you go 2-3 years down the line and everyone can tell you about the working capital project, but very few people can actually tell you about the detail of what happened and what they were trying to manage and what the tricky bits were. And going back to your friend at UPS, what were the standards to be maintained, and has this actually been embedded properly? And to some extent, we have to rely on people and their experience and their knowledge. But if we move them around the place, or they move, then it's very easy for that experience to be lost.
So there is clearly a need for continuity in terms of the working capital management team.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you refresh them? What do you do to keep them motivated?
Well, I mean, one of the things is is actually having a working capital team permanent, so that when you finish the project, what happens after that? And personally, I think it's a mistake that most companies make, is that they break up their working capital team and then they all go into the business, or people get promoted, leave, so on. You need an established working capital team, which needs to be part of the career path within the organization. So the people who are there today, naturally, they're going to move on to new and better things, hopefully within your organization over time. But that we then refresh the people coming into this. Hopefully they have new ideas, new technology, new things to try, which means that we don't just kind of say we just want to sustain our position. We actually want to sustain it and get better.
So one of the problems with working capital is making people understand the impact of what they're doing. Volvo famously developed games to show all levels of staff how the cash conversion cycle was affected in their department, their processes. Mm-hmm. Do you do that sort of thing? What would you recommend?
Well, I can understand what Volvo were trying to do, because, let's face it, there's many, many non-financial people in the organization, and what they do does have a very direct impact on what the working capital result is. But if you do just kind of go with them with slides, just bombarded with numbers, either they're bored or they don't understand it, or it's just too much for them. It doesn't sink in. So the idea of having something that's non-financial, of trying to get the message into people's heads so that they understand what is it they can do, what they should be doing on a day-to-day basis. If I talk to, I don't know, a store manager or something like that, and I start bombarding with the, last month's P&L and balance sheet, it's the eyes are just going to, kind of close very quickly. So I admire actually all the guys about thinking out of the box and looking for ways that, to help people who are from a non-financial ilk, because they are largely the people, then, be it sales, procurement, manufacturing, whatever. They're the people who actually sustain all this in the long run.
And what are the events that make a difference?
Well, my own personal experience is, in any business, bad events happen. You'd hope they wouldn't, but at some stage they tend to. And I've seen it so many times that whatever the reason was, it was a profits warning, it was, some event of fraud or something like that. They're all fairly kind of unusual one-off things, but what tends to happen then is the entire focus of the entire organization in emergency mode then goes over to this emergency thing, and everything else is forgotten. And unfortunately, if the right structures and measurements and so on have been in place already around working capital, then basically it's forgotten about, because everyone's focused on the emergency.
And there's similarly, mergers and acquisitions will take the attention away. If we move now to how to create a cash culture and sustain it, what's your experience there? What's the key starting point?
Well, the key point is right from the very top level. So, very often, it's senior executives at board level. They're the people who have the desire to improve working capital. Sometimes they don't necessarily get the message that they have to lead from the front. And that is important to the long run. It's not just a project. This is constant communication at all times on, just in the same ways they do about, innovation and profitability and all those other good subjects that companies want to be good at. This is another subject that has to be coming right from the mouth of the CEO.
And so presumably you're saying that the leadership, the CEO, needs to have clear policies on receivables, payables, and inventories.
Yep.
But how do they get people's attention? How do they keep their attention?
Well, a classic one that I find is just take on the policy front, that someone will say, oh yes, I have all my policies written down and documented and signed off, and they can be audited, and that's great. But it's sitting in a kind of, 60, 70 page document somewhere on someone's shelf. Again, go back to our non-financial people. How do they have access to these rules, and how is it communicated and refreshed with those people? And very often that doesn't happen. But equally, when it does happen, coming out with a 60-page document of all sorts of things which don't concern them just doesn't work. So you have to have versions of these things which are clear, maximum one-page documents that go out to folks right across the organization, so they know just a handful of key things they should be doing every day that contribute to the success of working capital management.
Now, incentives are always a driver, but they can be a driver for good behavior, but also for bad behavior. And there are classic examples of incentives for cash flow forecasting accuracy and other working capital management practices. What's the mature way of looking at introducing incentives?
Well, my own view, and many companies don't do this well, is that people should be rewarded for meeting cash targets in the same way as sales targets or cost targets in their budgeting process. Now, you don't see that happen very often, either because people don't budget very accurately at a cash level, or they're not particularly incentivized or punished for performing or not performing. But the old adage, unfortunately, is still true on the sales side that if your sales manager comes in and he's busted his sales target by 10%, it's unlikely he'll get fired. But if he missed his cash target by 10%, it's largely who cares. Now, the companies that really have this embedded don't think like that at all, and they have the whole thing. Be it that people are actually monetarily bonused, but also there's also the stick part of this equation as well. And organizations that do this well do that part well. I would say one point about stick versus carrot. Carrot is easy, just offering people money, but on the stick side, it's very important that people understand what they need to do in order to reach their targets, especially for non-financial people, because if they don't understand how to do it, they won't even try in many cases, and therefore you fail straight away.
So clearly there's a role for a dedicated working capital management champion. Is that often the case? I don't hear of it often.
I think for me, over the years, I hear of it more and more, but still not enough. I mean, the working capital champion thing kind of comes in many different forms. Sometimes it's a process owner. Sometimes it's a working capital champion, a working capital director. Sometimes it's treasury now is actively in charge of this as part of their, you'll see someone who's, group director of treasury and working capital or something like that. But it's important that there's somebody senior in the organization who's keeping their eye on the ball with this, not just in terms of the measurements and so on, but all the things that are going on underneath, so that there's a kind of an early warning mechanism that if things are drifting, that there's someone there to, grab it by the throat and say, listen, we need to change things. We need to change what we're doing so that we don't just drift back to the bad old days.
Now, the issue often with advice like this is that it's general and my specific company doesn't need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way of focusing people's minds, saying this is general and applies to every company, and these are areas which vary within industries or within companies? Well,
I think the generic advice is probably the same for everyone, but I think, as you rightly point out, it's kind of still fairly high level. So it is necessary kind of to make this sink in either at a national level, at an industry level, and so on, because there are nuances which have to be acknowledged and understood in all these different places. Because at the end of the day, a lot of this is around expectations management. So if your expectations are too high, you're going to fail, even though you could have done some really great work. And that's it does happen, unfortunately, and that's very much to be avoided. I'd say, generally, the other thing is the quality of advice out there oftentimes is not good. And I say that because many people will look at, many financial people, many treasury people, in fact, will look at the working capital subject and say, oh, yes, I know what this is all about. And that might be fine in terms of reading a balance sheet or a cash flow statement or something like that. But that's not the same thing as actually implementing these kind of changes. And you do come across roadblocks, you come across some very strange views, and they need to be tackled with. And that doesn't come from a book, unfortunately. And that's where a lot of advisors also fall down, because they're working for, shall we say, large accounting style organizations who actually haven't, got the dirt under their fingernails on this subject.
Now, the big question, though, is why do this? It's such that the interest rates are now so low that it doesn't matter whether you're efficient on working capital management or not, surely.
Well, personally, I just say one word: uncertainty. In any, I mean, we can all debate about what's driving uncertainty, be it Brexit and Trumponomics and all sorts of different things, and that will go on right into the future. But if we look at, say, since the big crash of late 2008, companies' cash reserves just keep on going up and up and up and up, and this is in one of the lowest interest rate environments we've seen, in a century. So you'd argue that there's something very illogical going on. It may be illogical, but I would argue that for most companies out there, they're basically hoarding rainy day money for, well, what if we do have a big crash? Maybe that never happens. But the other thing is, what if for some reason asset prices were suddenly to drop? The guy who's got lots of cash in his pocket then has a huge range of options.
Working capital success is clearly requires constant attention and keeping up the pressure, and there's no single answer to it. It's all of the things all the time, isn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. But I mean, that's I suppose it's like driving a car. If you were just good at changing gear and you're no good at anything else, well, the car's not going to go very far. You're actually doing a lot of things in combination.
Thank you very much. That's most interesting and I think most useful.